First of all, welcome to Wheaton College, and welcome to this Hastert Center event. We are really thrilled this evening to have you all with us in this special event that we are organizing this evening, and that we have a lot of expectation actually built up around it. Let me first to talk about a little bit on the Hastert Center. The J. Dennis Hastert Center for Economics, Government, and Public Policy is a center that has been created less than 2 years ago here at Wheaton College. Of course, following after the ideals and the guidelines that Speaker of the House Hastert had during his career. As you know, he is a graduate of Wheaton College, and as such, he was not only after that teaching economics and doing coaching, but he also became the longest speaker, Republican speaker in U.S. history to be in office at the House of Representatives. As a result of that, this idea came to create the Hastert Center, which in fact is a center that is created around the ideas of market economies, around freedom of institutions, free enterprise, decentralized decisions, but also to be able to integrate faith with action. In other words, on how can we bring the economics and the politics to bear about our faith so that we can transform whatever we are doing. And the objective of the Hastert Center is to be able to train students in the understanding of economics and politics, and to be able to build a bridge in between those two disciplines. Because if you want to be a good politician, it is important for you to have a good understanding on what politics, on what economics is saying, and how the sound decisions have to be made on economic basis. But also, if you are going to be doing business, or you are going to be doing things that are related to economics, it's important to understand government, to understand public policy, to understand how the politics of all things work, because this is going to bring in restrictions that otherwise are going to lead into bad decisions. So the Hastert Center has been put together as a bridge, as a bridging center between the politics and economics. And as such, we are right there in the middle with the economics department on top of us and the politics department also with us here at Wheaton College. It's a pleasure for us to have two very distinguished speakers with us tonight, and to be able to start this panel discussion. I will first start by introducing Dr. John B. Taylor, who is the Mary and Robert Raymond Professor of Economics and SIEPR Senior Fellow at Stanford University. And he is also the George P. Schultz Fellow in Economics at the Hoover Institution in California. John Taylor, he is an award-winning teacher and researcher. Among the most important things, or the things that I would say is most known for, is because he is the author of the Taylor Rule for monetary economics and for the management of monetary policy, actually. And he's somebody that has specialized himself in macroeconomics, international economics, and monetary policy. And one thing that Professor Taylor brings is a huge background of experience with government and doing public policy, not only on the academic side, but also working for government. So in other role, among other roles in public service, he has served as a senior economist and as a member of the President's Council of Economic Advisors on more than one occasion. He has also been the Undersecretary of the Treasury for International Affairs between 2001 and 2005, and during that time he was responsible for U.S. policies in international finance, including currency markets, financial services, foreign investment, debt and development, and oversight of the IMF, coordinating policies with the G7 countries and dealing with all the things that the U.S. had to deal with in terms of the international financial markets. His book, he's written many articles and several books as well. One book he wrote, it's called The Getting Off Track, How Government Actions and Interventions Caused, Prolonged, and Worsened the Financial Crisis. Was the first one to be written on the financial crisis, and it's still quite a relevant book because it pinpoints pretty much many of the issues that happened that led to this current financial crisis. He has since followed writing other two books, and one of them is on preventing future crises, that is a co-edition with other authors on talking about the road ahead for the Fed and ending government bailouts as we know them. In this last book, leading experts examine and debate proposals for financial reform and exit strategies to the current situation. Before joining Stanford faculty in 1984, Dr. Taylor held positions as a professor of economics both at Princeton University and Columbia University. He received his bachelor's in science degree, summa cum laude, from Princeton and a PhD in economics from Stanford University in 1973. Please allow me to welcome and join me in welcoming Dr. John Taylor. We also want to welcome Dr. Sanchez, President Gonzalo Sanchez de Lozada. He's currently a private entrepreneur working in the mining business. He was born in La Paz, the child of a diplomat and political exilee that had, because of that reason, to grow up here in the U.S. He graduated from the University of Chicago with a degree in philosophy, and after graduation, he went back to Bolivia to start a very interesting career. First, interestingly, he was involved as a movie producer, and then moved on into the mining business and founded what it became the largest private mining company in Bolivia. He started his political career and became an elected deputy for the province of Cochabamba in the Bolivian parliament, and he was representing his party, the Movimiento Nacionalista Revolucionario. After that, he became senator and was senator for 2 terms, in the second term becoming the president of the Senate, being that the highest position for parliament in Bolivia and also a successor for the presidency, as it is the case here with the Speaker of the House. Later on that, and because of the economic situation that the country was living, he moved on to the executive branch, and he authored the 1985 program that stopped the Bolivian hyperinflation. And he's probably most known because of that. But President Sanchez de Lozada then moved on and became the president of Bolivia for 2 terms. First, from 1993 to 97, and where he won the election by a landslide. And then again from 2002 and 2003. Mr. Sanchez de Lozada is also known for all the reforms and the reform process that he undertook in his first presidency that actually changed the country from a command economy and make it a market economy, and quite a successful country now in terms of its production, particularly of natural gas. He received many degrees and honorary prizes, and among them I have to mention that he also got a honorary degree, a doctoral degree from my school, which is Boston University. He is recognized as a leading voice for democracy in Bolivia, and many authors have spoken about his capacity as a statesman, and I may just cite this book from Stan Greenberg, Dispatches from the War Room in the Trenches with 5 Extraordinary Leaders, where Sanchez de Lozada is put together with people as Nelson Mandela and other great leaders in the world. Mr. Sanchez de Lozada presently lives in Washington, D.C. Thank you, President, for being with us tonight. Lastly, but not least, allow me to introduce you to our one of the senior professors here at the economics department, Dr. Peter J. Hill, P.J. Hill, as we all know him. He is also a graduate from the University of Chicago. He took essentially courses in agricultural economics. He's a rancher also from Montana, and he's known because he is an economist and at the same time working still in the agricultural business. And, but not only that, he's somebody that has done a lot of work essentially on institutional economics. So he's interested in his research in issues like property rights and the rule of law and other issues that are related to this institutional economics. So it's a pleasure for me to introduce P.J. Hill. He's going to be the moderator this evening, and I am going to allow him to take the floor. Thank you, Pete.
And I need to get some of my notes back from you. Okay. I had to just try to make sure I got my notes back from Javier there. So the format is going to be mostly interaction. We will ask Professor Taylor to speak for 10 minutes, President Sanchez to speak for 10 minutes. I will try to frame some questions for them, perhaps some they may want to react to each other. We will also ask for questions from you. If you'll notice in your program, there is a little card that on it asks for if you have questions for the speakers, you can jot those down. You'll have to do that fairly early. You can't wait to the very end. I'm not exactly sure when somebody will come through the audience collecting them, but when you see a couple of students wandering around collecting, you might want to finish up your questions at that point, and we will take those and we'll try to screen those and get through some of those too. Part of the problem is Professor Taylor's on a fairly tight schedule. He spoke at the Northern Iowa last night, and we were able to get him in here today. He's supposed to testify tomorrow morning on the Hill about the exit strategy for the Federal Reserve System in terms of where we are right now. So we're fortunate to have him here this evening. Because of that, we will be watching the clock and trying to finish up in time to get him to his plane this evening, and also let you get on to the rest of your activities. So I'll turn to Professor Taylor for some remarks about, and we are taking up some, the whole issue of emerging economies after the crisis. Professor Taylor has written about the economic crisis both in the United States and in the other economies of the world. So I'll let you take it out, start with whatever you want to go with, Professor Taylor.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks for coming. Thanks for inviting me. It's an honor for me to be on this table with President Sanchez de Lozada, who I greatly respect, and anxious to hear his remarks too and have this discussion. As you know from Professor Hill, the title is Emerging Economies After the Crisis, with a subtitle, which I think is quite apropos, Can Success Stories Teach Something to the Developed World? And I want to come back to that, but I want to begin because in some sense this crisis came from the developed world and hit the emerging market world with a vengeance. And I want to talk a little bit about that, talk about the reaction. So I've been working on the financial crisis and what caused it for quite a while. I've actually started before the crisis. And what I've tried to do is look at the things economists usually look at the data, look at what happened with interest rates, look what happened to the money supply, look at what happens to bank credit, all these things that economists focus on. And by doing that, I actually wrote one of the first books on the crisis, as Professor Camboni mentioned, called Getting Off Track. And this is a book which is not like a lot of the books you're seeing about the financial crisis, which tend to be who said what to who when, and that's valuable to be sure, but from an economic perspective, I think it's useful to start with looking at the things that probably were related to the crisis. And that's the timing, when did things happen, what's the sequence, can you see causality from one thing to another, so timing's important. It's important to think of what counterfactuals are, in other words, what would have happened if there were different responses. I think it's important to be as nonpartisan as possible because these are public policy issues where partisanship naturally comes into play. People want to defend their record. And by taking this approach, I think, come to some conclusions where which are quite striking, and some people agree, some people don't. I think over time, more people are agreeing, but it remains to be seen. But my general conclusion is if you look at all the possible causes, look at all the possible issues, look at the mistakes made in the private sector, look at what happened in government, what I generally find is that what comes to the top of the list, whether you look at what caused it, what prolonged it, what made it so bad, what comes to the top of the list is some kinds of government actions or interventions. So it's a kind of a different perspective that you frequently get, and I think that's an important lesson, certainly important to understand what happened in order to think of what the policy changes should be. So let me try to explain this briefly in my opening remarks. First of all, on the causes. I think there's no question, if you look back in the years 2003, 4, 5, that you see a period where interest rates were extraordinarily low by historical comparisons, at least by comparisons of the 1980s and 1990s, where things were working pretty well. We had long expansions, short recessions, historically speaking, in the United States, so it's working pretty well. But in this period of 2003, 4, 5, interest rates got very low. Interest rates are set by the Federal Reserve. They were well below historical experience. And I think those low rates, too low for too long, if you like, helped lead to the housing boom. Easy to get mortgages at low rates. Adjustable rate mortgages were very cheap. Teaser rates, they called them. You could get a low rate for a while on your adjustable rate mortgage. That increased the demand for housing, bid up housing construction, build up the housing prices. You had sometimes people call it a housing bubble, but it was certainly a housing boom. It led to a lot of mortgages being taken out that people probably should not have taken because prices were rising so rapidly. Led to risk-taking because interest rates were so low. People looked for ways to increase their yield by taking more risk. So all these things are the kind of things that lead to crises. They're, if you like, monetary excesses. And of course, what happened eventually is that boom, bubble, boom, whatever you want to call it, turned into a bust. Housing prices started to level off, actually started to fall, and plummet is the right word. So did housing construction. So mortgages went into foreclosure, into default, even the ones that were taken for reasons that seemed reasonable, but certainly the ones that were where people extended themselves too much. Those mortgages were held by financial institutions. Some of them were divvied up into securities and sold to other financial institutions, but those became defaults, foreclosures, bad debt, which made the financial institutions themselves very risky and very unstable. So I think if you look at the possible reasons for this, it seems to me those low interest rates are the reason, and I think they're related to monetary policy, since the Federal Reserve is in charge of setting the very low interest rates. To be sure, there's some disagreement with my critique, if you like, critiques of my critique, some coming from the former chairman of the Federal Reserve, Alan Greenspan, some coming from the current chairman of the Federal Reserve, Ben Bernanke. But the more that I think people look at it, the story seems to be consistent with these very low rates being part of the problem. But then in addition, when the crisis flared up, and I'd say it's really in the summer of 2007, interest rates started to rise in money markets in ways we had never seen before. I think at that point was also a government problem because the government misdiagnosed what was going on, in my view. It was clearly a problem of risk in the financial institutions that were holding this bad debt, bad securities. Instead, it was diagnosed more as what economists would call a liquidity problem, not enough money. And that was what was causing the rates to rise in the money markets. So the response of the government wasn't to try to address the problems in the financial institutions at the start, but rather to, if you like, add to a patient was sick, badly sick, instead of doing the treatment, the recommendation was to just take a little water and get some rest, that is, provide liquidity. And it didn't do much good. The Federal Reserve provided some extra ways that banks could borrow. There was a sharp cut in interest rates. That's more liquidity, more money. That shot oil prices through the roof, made the recession worse going into 2007. There was actually a fiscal stimulus passed in February 2008. That's the crisis is in the banking sector, but the stimulus was to send checks to individuals. Some people got $500, some people got $1,000. That was the first stimulus package. It didn't do much good. People just spent it, didn't increase consumption. Problems in the banking sector remained. And then perhaps most worrisome, there was a lot of sort of ad hoc attempts to intervene in the financial sector. One of the first firms to be visibly problematic was the investment firm Bear Stearns. That was rescued. The creditors of that institution were rescued. But then the next time a failing institution became visible, Lehman Brothers, they were not rescued. Then the next day, creditors were rescued. And then we had a large program to bail out the banks in general. So it's not so much whether there should be or should not have been the bailouts of the institutions, although I have my views on that. It was this chaotic response, which really people didn't know what was going on. And in fact, the claim sometimes that we were going to have a Great Depression 2.0, really serious systemic risk, I think scared people, and that really resulted in the panic of 2008. So that's sort of like, I think that the government actions and interventions are so important in a nutshell. But whatever, there was an enormous impact of this. Stock markets plummeted. In 3 weeks, the S&P 500 fell by 30%. Not just in the United States, all those stock markets around the world plummeted. You had exports decline in ways we'd never seen it before, so that's hurting now other countries, emerging markets. Exports that they were selling to the United States drop off the cliff. Investment drops off the cliff, inventories go down. So it was a real significant hit. It turned a recession into what economists now call the Great Recession, which shut off unemployment to 10%, and it's close to that level at this point. So there were lots of responses to this in the United States and around the world at this point. Some, I think, did some good. The Federal Reserve intervened in the commercial paper market, which stabilized things. People had their money some of their money in mutual funds, money market mutual funds. There was an effort to stabilize those. That was a positive development. But then there were some other government responses which I think are now leading to more problems. One was another stimulus package, about $800 billion. As far as I can tell in my research looking at the data, it hasn't really done much good. It hasn't really stimulated employment or GDP. The real factors are more on the private investment side. But it has added to the debt, and that's one of the problems that we need to address in the future. But let me, before going into the debt, let me try to get to the emerging markets here, because that's really the subject of the panel. So emerging markets were hit very, very hard by this, actually a bigger shock than they've seen for a long time. But what's, I think, quite remarkable is a good chunk of the big ones, the big emerging markets, China, India, Brazil, Turkey, those are the biggest, they responded remarkably well. They were hit, but they bounced back or really weren't affected as much as you might think. Certainly not in comparison to the 1990s when we had one emerging market financial crisis after the other. In Latin America, Southeast Asia, Russia, Turkey, all over the place. That didn't happen this time. Just by way to think about this, in India, the lowest growth rate of GDP in this crisis was 6.8%. That's as low as they got. And now they're, of course, back to 8-9% again. So to me, the message here is the emerging markets were doing something much better in this crisis than they did in previous crises, in the emerging market crises. And I think those are largely because they were following policies that were more sensible on the monetary side. They had gotten inflation down. Bolivia is one of the best examples of that, but other countries did as well. They had reduced the amount of borrowing that they had been doing. They didn't borrow in foreign currencies so much. There's more flexibility in those markets. So I think basically what you see here, and in fact this is why I think this subtitle for this conference is so important, what you see here is a lesson that by following, if you like, kind of orthodox, conventional, classical policies, sensible policies, keeping risk low, keeping borrowing low, keeping inflation down, the economy will be much more resilient to these kinds of shocks. So I think the message to me to the if you like, the developed economies, the economy we're sitting in right now, is really to follow these more sensible kind of policies, to worry about the debt, to try not have it go up so much, to keep the deficits down, certainly make sure you have price stability. That's the major lesson that I see. I think there's still questions for the future here, whether we're going to come out of this in the United States and globally strong enough to have a good growth in the future. There are some risks, inflation risk, now more abroad than in the United States. The contraction in the United States has held inflation down, at least temporarily. It's likely to rise again. I think there's also concerns for the future about the recession bringing on trade protection, if you like, or trade wars even, for protection from competition from abroad. So there's still a lot of things to worry about, but I think the lesson here, to me, is pretty clear that the emerging markets followed some good policies, not everyone, of course, but in general, much better than most people expected, and as a result, their performance has been much more resilient than in other countries. Thank you.
Thank you. President Sanchez, you've had experience in what we might think of as an emerging market country. As you look at the present crisis and as you think about lessons that maybe the developed world could learn from the developing world, where do you take us?
Well, I'd just like to make some comments. The crisis that took place, the many crises, the tequila, the Russian crisis, and that was so much, policies were changed as people got used to the fact that inflation, it's impossible to have a little bit of inflation. You can't be a little bit pregnant. You either are or you aren't. So the biggest problem is that many of these countries learned a very hard lesson. It took a long time to get it in. But most of them had flexible exchange rates. They also, with a process of going towards democracy, they had to be more conscious of the fact that they had to get away from the political weight of controlling prices, controlling exchange rates. But one of the things that helped all of these countries be a success story is commodity prices. Usually commodities go up about 3 times in the boom and go down about 3 times in the... But now we are in a stage that before, as you know, since the Great Depression in 1928, before the stock market went, the commodities went. And if you look at, in real terms, the price of commodities have been dropping until the end of the century. And now a new phenomenon has taken place, which is the industrialization of countries like China, countries like India, where when you do an industrialization with a lot of infrastructure, you need a lot of raw materials. Very sophisticated economies, developed economies, every time use less, recycle more, but today we're getting where we think we're going to look for a century of increasing, in real term, prices for commodities because of the great demand. And we have a saying in the mining industry, we have a saying in the mining industry that great prices make great miners. And great prices for commodities. Most of these countries had a terrible situation for a long time because they were dependent on exports of raw materials. And the exports of raw materials, every time you were paid less for what you exported, and you paid more. And everybody felt very unhappy about that situation. And they tried many things, like the famous model of doing closed market and industrializing. Well, we won't go through all of that. But we're in a new world now where the prices of commodities are still high. When the crisis took place, the bottom fell out of commodities. Many of the big oil and mining companies could be bought. Their stock market value was less than their working capital position. They had more money in their accounts than what all their assets was down to nothing. And everybody saw the beginning of the end. And of course, we have the Chinese, the Indians, and other people started buying again. And one of the big problems that we have to face, Bolivia knows it very well, we were traditionally, during the Industrial Revolution of the United States, we were producers of what were called the Chinese metals, basically tin, antimony, and tungsten. And we also always knew, be it an empire, be it a republic, or be it the communist system, the Chinese were just disastrous, or the effects of them, it wasn't that they were making mistakes, they have another policy, and their policies always meant that there was boom and bust in the metals. And I think we have a bit of a problem here, because although there's no doubt that the economies took advantage by managing it well, remember, the biggest problem, if you win the Irish sweepstakes, the biggest problem is hold on to the money. You end up minister, I think they learned, they didn't go wild, and they had very good policies, which, of course, we know that John Taylor and other people worked very hard to get going in international institutions. But they learned their lesson, they took advantage of it, but now we have a big question to ask. Is this price of commodities just a reality of industrialization? Do they present a risk of inflation? Can we really remember that when you get a cycle of industrialization like China, like India, and other countries like Brazil, and one day I suppose Russia, Turkey, and others, you will have a demand for raw materials that will be something that pushes it. I think it's interesting to note, in real terms, commodities have not gotten to the level that they had in 1928. So theoretically, we shouldn't be that worried. But at the same time, we see the boom, the housing boom. I think maybe John should go to China and tell them, look, this will happen to us. Maybe you have something to worry about. Because the biggest worry I had was the absolute confusion. The doctors couldn't get the diagnosis right. They kept telling us that we had a cold and we had pneumonia. And there was no clearness, and there isn't still any clearness in policy, in the sense that you don't know what the steps are going to be made. And we're it's like that story about a student who had a room below a party guy who used to go out and come home drunk, and he'd flop on the bed and he'd throw down one shoe and he'd fall on the bed. And the poor guy couldn't sleep until the guy threw down the other shoe, but he never did. He didn't know when it would come. So I think the big problem is we don't know how they're going to get back and return the assets of the central bank into a manner, because you go out and you start selling them, you'll have everybody running, nobody will know where it's going. And I think one of the things very important that should be analyzed, and I really recommend reading John Taylor's book. The greatest thing about his book, it's like Shakespeare said, the spirit or wit is the art of brevity. And it's a brief book, and it's actually clear. You can even understand it. Even a person who studied philosophy can understand it. And I want to speak well about that, because when I studied philosophy at the University of Chicago many pounds and many decades ago, we used to read a lot in the original, and we learned that Adam Smith and people like Newton used to write so people could understand it. Now it's buzzwords. They throw in a bit of math so you really get lost. And here you have a man who writes clearly, and we can even understand it, and I think it makes a lot of sense. Makes a sense because he's not interested in finding blame. He has his positions, and they're obviously orthodox like mine are, But he's not out trying to find who made the mistake, because the error is human, but to blame others is more human. So John gets away from that, and he just said, what happened? What happened? Instead of finding who was the doctor and let's put a malpractice lawsuit into him, and I think there was a lot of them wandering around of all sorts. The biggest problem that we have is to understand this phenomenon. Now, what will happen in the future? Because remember, when you have industrializations, the change between the Civil War and the recession, the growth, the turn of the century of the U.S. with industrialization was just incredible. The growth of the cities, but there was some really scary crises and panics. And I think one of the best things in your book is that you talk about the fact that people have to sort of expect things. Give them bad news, and I would like to feel I remember when you wanted to find somebody to accompany you with a girl's roommate when you took her out on a date many, many years ago. I don't know if that exists anymore. You had to get somebody to go with her roommate. And I used to tell him that she was really intelligent, really charming. Then I finally learned, tell him the worst. She's terrible, but you got to do it for a friend of mine. And when they got there, it wasn't that bad, and they were quite happy to be there. So I think the problem is to give the people some knowledge, or even cheat a little bit, say it's going to be worse, but don't keep them confused. Don't keep them with an expectation, irrational or rational. And that's one of the big things. Are the doctors diagnosing it right? Where are we going? And I think we can learn quite a bit. And it's that most of the emerging markets, we don't know about China and India really, but most of the emerging markets are being helped by commodity prices, but are being run on a much more orthodox, a much more predictable. They're not telling you exact, but they're doing things, and they're probably reading your rule, the John Taylor rule, and they're probably being closer to that than the developed economies. The developed economies are so surprised that they're going from one extreme to the other, and you can't believe, when banks go, you have to save them all. You may guarantee, you may pay a fee, but you can't let a bank go for the simple reason that it's been regulated. And when you regulate it, it's like the Chinese story. If you save a man, you got to keep him alive for the rest of his life, because that's what they say happens in China. If you save a drowning man, the banks, the big problem with banking, and it's all over the world, is that they just have to be strictly regulated simply because they're handling other people's money with big leverage. And they are too dangerous to let them go. And once they start going, you've got to save them all. You can't save one and the other because you'll confuse everybody. I know it's unfair. I know it shouldn't be that way. But the fact is, it'll drag us all down. And economy shouldn't be justice. That's for the Lord to decide. It should be more than anything predictable order. I'd like to end with a very good phrase from a philosopher, Whitehead, who used to say progress is change with order and order with change. And I think one of the big problems is that the emerging markets have behaved better in the sense that they've been changing with order, and the developing markets have gotten out of control. There's a lot of people to blame, but I think what we got to try to do is let's find out what he has, save the patient, and then we can condemn him to death or have him shot. But we've got to save him first. And I think that's the biggest problem we have to look at. And I think John has a lot to say on that with his different analysis, because he's not trying to find the guilty. He's trying to find the solution.
Thank you. I'll ask a couple of questions here, and then I think before too long, you'll get a chance to turn your questions in. Professor Taylor, you talked some about the successful economies. in the developing world. There's certainly both in the developed and the developing world. There are some that are unsuccessful. We could say, look at Greece, Portugal. You know, might want to put Venezuela in that category in terms of not so successful. What do you see? You talked about some of them that were successful. What's the distinguishing factor between those that are successful and unsuccessful? And I'm not sure where you put Greece in terms of which category, but it certainly is an economy that's struggling some right now. What distinguishes those?
Well, I think what distinguishes them is the same things we were talking about here, that the policies is the biggest thing. The Greeks and their Greek government hasn't dealt with the debt as they should. Their deficits have grown, some of it with some questionable accounting of what the debt actually is. There's actually, you can also look at these rules and say they actually had a policy which was too easy at one point. So I think that's really what's going on. I think if you look at, another country which fared very poorly in this was Iceland. And there you can see quite well they had a banking system that was really out of control. So big compared to the country itself that you couldn't possibly support the default or on the banking system. So that obviously a mistake, I think, in terms of their own regulations. So for the most part, I know life is complicated, but here it seems pretty simple. You can look at the correlations, and policies make a difference, and good policy has worked well and bad policy hasn't.
Also, they're not to produce. Just one comment. Neither Greece nor Spain or other countries that are Iceland are producing commodities. It's a great thing to produce oil or other valuable commodities. And that saves a lot of the economy. But I think the economies that emerging market economies are doing well again because they're better run than some of these other economies that, thinking they're part of the European Union, have done an awful job.
Question for you, President Sanchez. You talked about the necessity of some sort of stability of expectations. I'll kind of put this one right to you then, given the volatility in Latin American politics. How do you get stability of expectations in Latin American countries?
Well, I think there's a phenomenon that Latin America is split between populist, very radical and drug finance changes countries like my own, Ecuador, Venezuela, and the radicalism comes from Cuba, and found somebody to support them that when Russia disappeared, and that's Venezuelan commodities. But that said, there's other countries, obviously, like Chile and Brazil and other countries that have been able to do better. And I think that we have a phenomena that's quite extraordinary because it's a political and social phenomena that's related to a business that is really a free, wild market, which is the market for illicit drugs and connected with very violent people. It can be a very serious problem. And this is part of a general problem in a world where you really can't separate the social from the economic. But in the long run, these things have to be dealt with because you can't have a perfect separation. Good commodities keep these people going. And one of the best commodities you can produce, at least not the countries don't get such benefit, but one of the biggest activators, of course, is the drug industry that pays no taxes, very violent and very brutal, and it can affect the stability of a political system and drag down a basically sound economic system. But that said, again, I think that if you have good economics, you generally have good politics. And as I said, the big crises are usually solved by politicians because it has a lot to do with credibility. If you don't get a change, if you don't see something new, and you sure can't waste that occasion And I think that one of the big problems here is the high level of uncertainty, where we really don't know. Many people talk about a double dip. I'm very heartened to see that you don't feel that's going to go that way. But I think that we're all worried about the fragility of the European Union, where they would spend a lot, they would give a lot of money to their new partners for infrastructure, but they won't give them a penny to help them out. I'm afraid that morality or value judgments is not a good way to run an economy.
Professor Taylor, there's been some discussion. You mentioned Iceland. President Sanchez mentioned regulation of banking. Is there an appropriate, or what would you think of as appropriate financial regulation in terms of trying to not to? I know you talked a lot about monetary policy. Some concerns about regulatory policy also. Where do we go there? And is there a race to the bottom in terms of financial regulation, in terms of, is it possible to have national regulations, or does that have to be something broader than that?
Well, I think our regulation has to be improved dramatically. I think a lot of it is the institutions or the markets that are already regulated were not regulated as people thought they would. It's going back to this thing of what's the rule, and if the people are assuming the rules are being enforced and they're not, that's going to cause great confusion. So in this case, the commercial banks, the most heavily regulated financial institutions we have, is where a lot of the problems occurred. Some of it because they had off-balance sheet operations that the regulators allowed to have happen, and so you got to stop that. Some of it has been caused by what you say, race to the bottom. Although I would say it's more just sometimes there's holes or gaps in the regulatory process. You might not have institutions that are regulated because they're new and you don't know quite how to handle it, or because you don't know who's in charge. Is it the Office of Thrift Supervision, or is it the controller of the currency? And so that has to be improved as well, if you like, filling the gaps and deconflicting institutional responsibility. But I think for the most part, you don't need to expand the regulation. You need to enforce the regulation that's already there. And I think you can see that in many cases in the United States and in other countries.
Okay. Javier, do you have some questions for me there from the floor? I know he's trying to sort them through here while we're going through them, but
Picking only the tough questions.
yeah, I'll take some of the
Tough for him, not for the ex-president.
Okay. What about the risk question? I think this one would probably be for Professor Taylor. Was regulation or government involvement in terms of the financial markets? This question asks, can unfettered financial markets work when we have such complex financial instruments? Or you said that we basically need to keep in place or do a better job with the regulations. Certainly in the last couple of decades, there was a creation of a whole host of instruments that were, if not brand new, fairly innovative. How do you deal, or can markets deal with the complexity of financial instruments, and what sorts of regulations do deal with that?
Well, I think of the crisis itself, a lot of people say it's due to credit default swaps or derivatives more generally. One of the ironies in Europe, people are complaining that the problem with Greece is we had these credit default swaps, which doesn't make any sense. They're just people taking positions on Greece. So I think there's a mass of confusion here about derivatives and new kind of instruments being the cause of the problem. I don't think they are. But you do have to look at regulation of new instruments. For example, the securities which were bundled together to make mortgages easy to sell. I mean, those were terrific innovations in the past, that you could bundle a lot of mortgages together and then sell them. It made housing markets much more efficient. But then they got carried away and had these very, very complex securities, and there probably should have been more transparency about that, if you like, requirements that what was in those securities, and I think that would have improved things. So I think there was definitely a risk. And by the way, I don't want to say that there's no problems with markets. People make mistakes in private sector and they make mistakes in government. What we have to be sure, though, is that the mistakes in the private sector, we don't perpetuate by bailing them out all the time. A firm that's made some mistakes, and so it's going to fail, should be allowed to fail. We need to find a way that that failure doesn't transmit to the rest of the economy and cause a lot of damage. And I think that's where you want to look at the risk. If people always expect the government is going to be there to bail you out, then they will take risks. They figured, hey, why not take this risk? Why not gamble on this? I'm going to get bailed out. And that's what we got to focus on, I think, and do it in a way that you can allow a firm to fail, but not have all these ripple effects around the economy. It's not easy, but that's really what the goal should be, it seems to me.
Okay. Another question for you, and then I'll have one for President Sanchez. What do you see as the biggest threat or threats to the U.S. economy now? And along with that, there's another question, where are we in terms of the business cycle? So you might comment on where we are in terms of the business cycle, maybe a bit more short-term, and then long-term in terms of threats.
Well, we're coming out of the recession in terms of the business cycle. It's always important to remember when economists say the recession is over, it doesn't mean that times are good right away. It basically means things have stopped getting worse. That's what we mean. The recession is over. Things have stopped getting worse. But it's going to be a long time before things get back to the good old days. So that's the business cycle. And I think it'll take longer this time. And part of that's related to the second part of the question, what's the biggest concern? To me, the biggest concern is really these growing deficits and growing debt, mainly by the federal government, but also by state and local governments. I'm from California, one of probably the worst at this point, but there are others. And that's the biggest concern. You have the debt is growing in ways which it's hard to describe how bad it is. Just a couple of statistics. At the end of the Reagan administration, the debt to GDP ratio was 40%. So dividing the debt by GDP gives a measure of how you can service the debt. So debt to GDP, 40% at the end of Reagan administration, 40% at the end of the last Bush administration, Bush 40%. The CBO now projects it will be 90% at the end of the next 10 years. And then if you just extrapolate it, it just goes bananas, 700% by the time you guys are, you students will be retiring. So it's a terrible problem. Government spending is the next 10 years is projected to be 24.1% of GDP, that's federal spending, compared to 20% in the past 10 years. So all these things are a concern to me, and I think they should be a concern to you as well.
Okay. Thank you. President Sanchez, somebody is wondering about how you were, when you took over the presidency in Bolivia, the country was in the midst of one of a very major crisis of hyperinflation. How did you get out of it, and what lessons would you draw from that for other developing economies?
Well, I would say for generally when you have crisis, you have crisis. The Chinese have a very wise thing that crisis is the same figure as opportunity. Most really serious problems you can only work if it's a real serious crisis. And it's just people won't take the medicine and the politicians won't run the risks. And usually when the crisis is so great, it's pretty clear what you have to do. And I just want to make a comment that worries me about the situation now. It's a little bit hyperinflation, and deflation is a little bit like a tire. You have one bullet to get it. And if you don't get it the first time, you don't have a second time. He's going to eat you if you don't eat him. And I'm worried about what happened here because you had all of these problems coming up, the housing boom going down, and these organizations that really knew they were in trouble, and they were hiding it. And nobody could tell people what was happening. So I think that the lesson that you have, there comes a point where people accept this type of thing and it has to be solved and you can take decisions quickly. But if you lengthen it out, you don't get another chance. And I'm worried about the long time it took to get it going. For instance, I can't believe you have to you spent $700 billion and you didn't have some growth in employment. Explain it to me, but it'll make me unhappy. But the problem is that I personally don't worry so much about that, as when you get expectations, crisis leads to expectations. How can you explain that Germany, France, especially Germany and France and Great Britain, contributed unbelievable amount of money for investment in the people who joined in education and infrastructure? The best trains in Spain were made with German money. But if Spain wants money, they're going to find the Germans saying, I don't want to give you a penny, you be misbehaved. Well, if you're going to be judging others, the Lord can judge others, can judge you, but you better not become the Lord. Because I can't understand, they're all uptight about saving these people. They don't deserve to be saved, but they have to be saved so you can get your house back in order and try and get away from it. So I think that what you do with your scenarios, maybe you can explain it, is very important. If we could just have the Chinese look at what happens when housing boom goes. They have a very different effect when the stock market goes to pieces. We were talking about the big drop in the crisis that took place with the internet. Well, that was people who were betting, and possibly there was too much exuberance. But when housing goes, that's the wealth, the stability of a family. A house isn't something you buy and sell. A house is where you live. And that is really dangerous. It's like a farmer, or any type of farmer in Africa or any place, we're going to take away your land. So the big problem, I think, is the psychological effects. And you better have some quick solutions and some doctors who can analyze it and not look for blame, look for solutions.
Actually,
Good. I
just
would
the
like to have
interaction
you
here.
Talk about the $700 billion. I'd like to know where it went.
It's a good question. So the question is, how could you spend $700 billion and not have a big impact on jobs? It's a good question, and that's what my research shows. And I think there's a few reasons. One is that of the 700, it's actually closer to 800, of that money, in the first year, only 21 billion, so a small fraction, is for infrastructure, is for the roads and building that we really usually think about. It comes from a stimulus package. Other parts of it were one-time payments to individuals. And so first of all, the 21 is small in a huge economy and small compared to the 700, so that's part of the explanation. But also when some of the money is sent to individuals hoping that they will spend it, and they don't spend it, they save it, then that doesn't create jobs either. So those are the two biggest things. I think the third is that a good chunk of the money, for good or for bad, is not naturally job creating. And I'll use an example of my own university, Stanford. Stanford got a good chunk of stimulus money. Maybe Wheaton did too, I don't know. But that stimulus money, I can't argue it's not used for good purposes. Some goes to medical research, some goes to research to help the environment. But it's really hard to see how it's creating jobs, at least so far. Maybe eventually a research assistant will be hired. But it's not the kind of thing that creates jobs and gets you out of the recession. And as good as it might be, I mean, you know, a stimulus package has some good things in it and some bad things in it. But that's one that's kind of hard to say and hard to demonstrate it creates jobs. So I think that's the kind of thing you look at.
Okay. We're almost out of time. I'll ask Professor Taylor one more question, and he gets to decide does he catch his limo or not, depending on the length of his answer. Several of the cards.
Listen to you in Washington anyway, so stay here.
Now, if you ask him long questions and you would prefer not to have him testify tomorrow, then you can keep him here, and he won't make his plane to D.C. Several of the questions here deal with the whole question of commodities, and President Sanchez said, you know, what is causing the rise of the price of commodities? And I know for a monetary economist, maybe that's not an area that you get into that much, but he was saying, is it risk? Is it industrialization? Do you see a relationship between commodity prices and the health of emerging economies? What's going on there?
Yeah, no, I think the points are very well taken. It's not a general inflation. It's related to inflation, but it's the relative price of commodities compared to other goods. And I think that's kind of another way to think about this very strong growth, global growth, which isn't, even though it's not here much or in Europe much or in every country, it's China, it's India, it's Brazil, and it creates a huge demand. It's if you think about China, 1 billion people trading in their bicycles for automobiles, that creates the demand for a lot of commodities. So I think he's exactly right.
Well, I have a lot of good questions here, but we do need to end the program. I would like to thank both of our participants for being with us, and thank you as the audience. Thank you and good evening.